Builds are always better with explosions, and explosions are Plague Repeater's specialty. By converting Repeater's damage to Plague, you get to fully scale the explosions from your last prayer. These trigger when you kill an enemy with Repeater. In addition, this now means you can slow enemies and even freeze them in place, making Repeater much easier to play. The conversion means you can stack both physical and Plague damage modifiers, giving you more options for your gear and relics. Now, before I get into things, a quick note. This is a showcase and not a guide, because I got the build from Mark, one of the developers at Rogue Snail. Originally, he put this build together while we were testing the balance for patch 1.1 on the PTR. But since I love explosions, I mentioned it sounded cool, and he kindly shared his save file and said that I could showcase it. So, with that note, let's get into things, starting with Relics and Constellations. So let's start with unique relics. Last Prayer is used to trigger explosions, dealing a significant portion of Repeater's damage as Plague in a, well, it says small area, but if you invest in some AoE, a quite generous area. This is a very powerful effect as it can chain through packs, since this counts as Repeater damage, so any enemies killed by Last Prayer will themselves explode, triggering a second wave of damage. In terms of modifiers to look out for, bonus to Fizz damage is good, or bonus to Plague damage, or even Agi Orb as the Imbuement. Those are all great. For prefixes, Plague damage, Fizz damage, maybe some crit chance, maybe some cooldown, though those two aren't as important, and of course crit damage. For suffixes, resistances, life, and experience gain is surprisingly useful as it will get you extra levels. The next very important unique is Arapuka. Repeater deals a massive amount of multiplicative damage to slowed enemies. As a small relic, it can only have one affix, which in this case is attack speed, a very good suffix indeed, though that could be res or life as well. And this one has a 30% multiplicative life as a corrupted implicit, which is super awesome. You probably won't have that on yours, but hey, it's a good corruption target because there is basically nothing that can brick. The reason this is so powerful for the build is your Plague damage can blight enemies, which slows them. Arapuka triggers against slowed enemies. So you don't just have slow time, this will also slow enemies down, but you can just hit them and they'll slow down, giving you a perfect opportunity to deal damage. I would describe those two unique relics as mandatory, everything else is optional, but some of them are very nice. Garrison supplies, for example. During the active effect, so that is when you use Prayer Vengeance and intensify the buff, you gain 100% projectile amount, stacking with all of your other projectile amount, but deals slightly less damage. Do not use a low tier version of this, and also make sure to maximize the rank. High tier, high rank has a relatively small penalty. Low tier, low rank has a very high penalty and simply isn't worth it. Also, this one happens to have a life prefix, which, while it won't increase your damage, is a very good defensive mod and can help you get a respectable amount of life. Maybe grab a couple of those across your gear. That said, how many you need is going to depend on your ability to dodge enemies. If you don't dodge too much, you'll probably need more than one. If you're good at dodging, you might not need that many. For suffixes, same as before. Life and res, maybe even some EXP if you can fit it. Next up we have Death Notary. When enemies are affected by your slow time, they become exposed to take 30% more multiplicative damage from all sources. Slow time duration is reduced, and you can reduce the reduction by increasing the tier or rank of your relic. This feels very good to play with, as enemies that are slowed by slow time are pretty unlikely to dodge out of your attacks anyway, so this is another potent damage multiplier which you can stack on top. Now, once you go Plague Conversion, you'll have a way to automatically slow enemies. Early on, you'll be reliant on slow time anyway, which makes this even better because it's free damage. Last up, there is the Northerner Belt and Bundle of Rope. The Northerner Belt triggers Lasso, which groups enemies. Then the Bundle of Rope applies Lifelink, causing them to share damage. These two relics work really well together and are especially nice for Repeater, which is essentially a single target skill. You need to single target something down to then trigger all of the Last Prayer explosions, giving you the AoE. With Lifelink, you can absolutely obliterate a rare by simply lifelinking it with all the trash and then exploding the trash with your Last Prayer. So overall, this synergizes very well with the rest of the build. but it isn't strictly mandatory. If you don't have these two and you're playing the build, certainly go out of your way to get them, but expect things to work pretty well even without. Next up, let's look at some of the rest of our relics. First up, this relic is primarily being used because it rolled really well, plague damage is useful, res is useful, and it got 100% skill projectile amount. Yeah, the skill projectile amount, corrupted implicit, pretty darn insane. So if you get a drop like this, you're probably going to be using it. And here we have even more skill projectile amount, some plague damage, some life, some fizz damage. Really, the only stat here that is kind of wasted is mana, but it's not even that wasted as mana can be a bit of an issue, so having a little more doesn't hurt. Next up, we've got a whole bunch of large relics with things like repeater mana cost reduction, wither buildup rate, deal additional damage against blighted enemies, all res, and repeater damage, repeater mana cost. This is part of why the mana cost is so hard to deal with, but it is also quite valuable as it is 92% multiplicative damage. There are a lot of good options which you can craft onto large relics using a greater tool of enhancement, making this a fairly flexible slot. Now, long term, you're probably going to want to replace most of your other relics, especially for rare ones, with smalls. That's because smalls can have the same potency of rare affix, but in a little form factor. All you lose out on are the prefixes that don't become quite as valuable as you get more and more relics. When it comes to constellations, your path is simple. Start at the Three Marys and unlock the Discipline path. Next, head through Expeditus. This physical damage will actually do quite well for you early on, and the plague damage will be good later. You get some evasion, and you get the ability to generate agility orbs, which is really important for marksman builds. It's important because here you have the marksman constellation, which gives 30% multiplicative projectile amount, not self-multiplicative, mind you, so all your agi orbs add up to one big pool, but it gives you projectile amount, and it gives you damage per agility orb. This is self-multiplicative. So this doesn't go 10, 20, 30. This goes 10, 21, 32. Unfortunately, it does also increase the skill's mana cost, so again, lower that mana cost with some other relics. After that, you want to head up top to get Herbalism, converting all physical damage and physical damage bonuses to plague damage. This way, you get extra fizz damage and plague damage. The plague damage here is now relevant. You get to take all the fun plague damage stuff here, and you get to take all the agility orb investment. If you need, you can grab some mana. You can even come up here and grab some mana restoration. You can also grab life and damage, and you can grab this constellation, which is really good quality of life. You get a damage bonus for picking up gold, and you get extra gold, which you can use for things like rerolls, which will be very cheap thanks to Oxum's piety. Now at this point, you're probably wondering, why are there only 4 skills? The short answer is, to more consistently get valuable blessings on the skills that are being used, especially repeater. The long answer is, you can use Judgment if you want an extra button to hit, and focus on lowering enemy plague resistance, but you only get so much EXP and only so many levels within a run. And most of the blessings for some of the other skills like Passage and Slow Time already don't directly contribute to your damage. So going with 4 skills gives you a more consistent build. With that out of the way, let's get into some details. Repeater is your main skill. Use it to kill enemies when clearing, and you can trigger the explosions from Last Prayer, wiping out entire packs almost instantly. To this end, you'll probably want 1 Plague Explosion blessing, as it gives you a good amount of AoE more or less for free, especially if it's a low rarity blessing. On single target, you gain that huge boost thanks to Arapuka, which normally requires you to slow enemies with slow time, but thankfully, plague damage has its own slow in the form of a blight ailment, so you get the benefit on pretty much everything. This is especially helpful for wiping out tanky rares. And since this is a marksman skill, there are a whole bunch of ways to scale it. You can evade for counterstrike, you can deal damage against blighted enemies, you can get additional projectiles via agi orbs because it's a marksman skill. Yeah, all the good stuff. You can even use garrison supplies for even more projectiles, though as you continue to min-max, it'll fall a bit behind perfect top-tier rares. When it comes to blessings, almost everything is good in some way, but you do have to be mindful of your mana costs when taking skill speed. So, in general, I would say get one Plague AoE explosion for quality of life, then try to balance damage and crit damage, as those are the ones you don't really have to think about. If you're comfortable with your mana, work in skill speed. If you think you need a little extra mana recovery, then work in mana cost reduction. Next up, Prayer of Vengeance, which is primarily there for the passive crit strike chance and crit strike damage. Use the active component for bosses and tanky rares. Now, all of the blessings here are good, but if you are using garrison supplies, you want to go out of your way to lower the cooldown of the active portion or increase the duration. This way, you have more uptime on the projectile bonus. If you are not using garrison supplies, then you don't necessarily need this, as you'll be able to burst down most enemies before the buff falls off anyway. The exception here being some of the tankier bosses, especially in Act 3 or Void. So instead, go for crit chance and crit damage. Keep an eye on your crit strike chance on your sheet, because you don't want to get over 100%. Anything past 100% is wasted, and your marksman skills do get a little extra crit, though like 90-ish%, you should be totally good. Now, slow time and passage are just there as utility skills. This means they don't directly contribute to your damage, or at the very least, they're blessings don't. Passage is all about mobility, so lowering the cooldown is good. Slow time does technically contribute to your damage through the Death Notary relic, which means increasing the area of effect or scaling the duration is nice. However, it should be up whenever you need it anyway, and it will very rarely fall off before the enemy's dead. So again, the blessings here aren't too important, but you can always opt for higher rarity blessings to maximize the skill rank. And then last up you have Blessing of Foundation. Now, if you aren't using garrison supplies and you have a low projectile count, your best bet is to max out the lethality tree for additional projectiles. If you do have high projectile counts or garrison supplies, I don't think the 30% damage penalty is worth it. So instead, you could stop at lethality 3 for the plus 50% proj damage. That's still very good. Or you could max out the crit path and cap your crit that way. Or you could shred enemy plague resistances by going for Blessing of Force. This is the elemental damage blessing. Last up, you could also go with the Life Blessing for extra defenses. I don't particularly recommend the Move Speed Blessing just because I found mana was always just on the edge for me, and if I took the Movement Speed into Attack Speed branch, I did end up struggling for mana unless I took minus mana cost blessings. That said, in comparison to the past builds that I've talked about, because I'm showcasing someone else's save file, I have relatively low playtime. I did a few runs through Oblivion, and I did a couple of attempts on Void, so I have played the build a bit, but I have not had the depth of experience that comes with building a character up, going all the way through all the difficulties, and rounding out your gear. Speaking of, let's talk about Blessed Gear and Great Bell passives. Alright, so Blessed Gear. On your weapon, look for base damage, or damage fizz damage, damage plague damage, damage skill projectile amount, damage attack speed. Depending on what stats you have elsewhere, all of these could be great options. For your left ring, go crit chance. You can also get life leech here, but ultimately I would recommend getting that on a relic instead if you feel the need for life leech. For your right ring, you can go for base damage or crit damage. Again, depending on your gear, these are fairly similar. For this build, it's definitely going to be base damage because the skill projectile amount guns have a lower amount of base damage. But if you had pure base damage here, you might actually want to go crit damage. For helmet, fizz res, and evasion, as a marksman build, evasion is the easiest defense to stack, so you might as well lean into it. Chest piece, same thing, although early on you can very much go for elemental resistances instead, as those will help you cap. At this point, not only is the build capped, the build is overcapped, pretty much good for Void, though maybe some of that fire and lightning should be spread to physical and plague. So don't need resistances there. On your shoulders, get evasion. Again, useful for getting up to that cap if possible. Belt, attack speed, it's the best option. Pants, fizz res if you need, cooldown if you don't. While cooldown does not contribute a ton to your damage, it is still nice quality of life for lowering all these skills. Which, yes, you also want to keep these skills at a fairly low level. The only one you level up to max is Repeater. On boots, movement speed and life. Life is great for your survivability, and you shouldn't need the res here. On your accessory, life, because you don't really need mana or conviction. Now, for your keepsake, the ideal is mana and cooldown speed, but if you are struggling with mana, you can go mana and mana cost reduction instead. Next up, let's take a look at the Oblivion Bell. Now, if you're familiar with my normal trees, this is quite different. So, normally what I would do is grab all the game features like Blessing Banish and Second Wind and probably the mana cost reduction and fill it out from there. Mark has not done that. Instead, he has gone with a much more aggressive version of the tree. So, this is very good at progressing faster, but it does lack a few of the creature comforts like Blessing Banish and Red Portal. That said, not all of these nodes are strictly mandatory, i.e., you could drop these 4 in Hellclock Timer, put them into Blessing Banish and Red Portal, no problem. But he gets quite a bit of Hellclock Timer, of course, +1 starting Blessing, very powerful, 4th Blessing. These are, in my opinion, fully mandatory. On the bottom, progressing, of course, through base damage. You always want damage for your build. Second Wind on the right, the build would feel a little bit squishy without it, especially since it isn't always going to be evasion capped. Crit on the left, because crit is good, and it's a good way to pick up extra evasion, extra attack speed, and extra movement speed. Last but not least, he comes over here to grab some extra resistances with a specific focus on Phys Res. Again, this is a very efficient tree if you are trying to rush through content, but if you're missing the creature comforts, you can absolutely drop a couple points here. In fact, you could drop some of the Phys Res here, make up for it with 1 affix on your Relics, and grab those creature comforts like Blessing Banish, Red Portal, and even the skill mana cost reduction. Since all you need to get started is Arapuka and Last Prayer, Repeater is a great skill to use to clear Act 1. It won't be Plague Repeater, so your single target damage will suffer in comparison, but you'll still get those awesome explosions that chain through packs like butter. And it continues to scale all the way into Oblivion and, of course, the Void. In comparison to Conviction builds that I've played, it is a bit squishier, but you have plenty of safety being able to stand back or wither foes to prevent them from moving. So it is more than sufficient defensively to get through all the content currently in the game. I also found it to be quite nice in Ascension, because in Ascension you have earlier access to Constellations, so you can convert your damage over to Plague pretty much from the start and blast through Act 1 as a full-on Plague Repeater build. And so I'd like to wrap things up with a big thanks to Mark for sharing his save file and letting me showcase the build. If you're looking for something else to watch, you can check out my Powder Bags Minion video or my Veil of Quills build. Both of them are absolutely excellent. You'll find them up in the card and down below. For now, thank you very much for watching to the end. I'm glad you've enjoyed. Be sure to leave a like, and I'll see you in the next one.